The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar under the University Startup Development webinar series. Today's topic is about building a management and leadership team, as well as putting together a board of directors and advisors. So this program and this webinar series is being brought to you by the different startup development officers that are working with us, whose main task is to assist universities, faculty, and researchers, as well as students and entrepreneurs, create, develop, and fund their startups that are created around university IP. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and hopefully you have a good time. So our webinar for today, before we begin, I'd like you to know that for 2017, our last webinar for this year will be on December 13th, so that's next week, and that webinar will be on employment and consulting agreements. So for 2018, we will have a brand new set of courses, a list of programs, so please watch out for upcoming announcements. We will have questions at the end of the session, so please look at your GoToWebinar control panel. All you need to do is type in your question to the staff, and we will queue up your answer at the end of the session today. As you know, the slides and video are available for you to view after the webinar concludes. So all you need to do is go to ncet2.org/webinars, and you should be able to see all the webinars in this series, as well as go to our YouTube channel to see some of the videos, not just of this series, but for past webinars as well. Now, this webinar is aimed to promote our program, the Startup Development Program, and allow you to engage with us and the startup development officers that work with us to help create startups. So if you're a university, all you need to do is submit IP or startups to us. Applications are now open. All you need to do is go to ncet2.org, and the SDOs and the corporates in our corporate selection committee will review and score your IP and startups to determine if you're a good candidate for the Startup Development Program to receive assistance from our SDOs. If you are an ex-corporate, an open innovation or venture capital corporate person, a serial entrepreneur, an active angel investor, you can become one of our SDOs. If you're interested, just email us at startupdevelopment@ncet2.org. Send us your CV and a short note, and we'll be in touch with you to schedule a phone call and talk about what being an SDO for NCET2 is about. All right, so going forward, I will now introduce our two speakers for today. So our first speaker is NCET2's Director for Business Development and Alliances, Dr. Glenn Vonk. He was a former Director of Advanced Technology at BD Tech. Our second speaker today is an NCET2 Startup Development Officer, as well as an angel investor. She's also a board member of Washington, D.C. Archangels, Dr. Christine Koppel. So I'll turn it over now to Glenn to talk a little bit more about the Startup Development Program.
Thanks, Ria. Glad to talk about this, and having been part of a lot of startup reviews and things, the management team is often a very important part of creating a startup. So I'm going to do some review of NCET2 as an organization. Some of you have heard this before. I'm going to move quickly through it, and if there's something that is not covered that you want to know more about, there'll be a Q&A session at the end, as Ria mentioned, where you can ask your question. So what we're going to talk to you today is come out of really a 3-year process at NCET2, where we began with Congress to work on understanding how university research is commercialized. We did that by talking to many universities, to our corporate network. It's about 125 to 150 universities, depending on how you count, and over 30 Fortune 300 companies. From that, we developed a model of how the ecosystem functions, what some of the issues are around that, reported that to Congress, and then developed the demo day as a way to efficiently connect people up, to connect university startups to corporate partners of our potential partners. We did this twice. we received quite a good bit of good feedback from that. And then we've been doing a similar activity for intellectual property within universities, where universities have intellectual property that they think would be really great packaged into a startup. And so we started to enable that with our IP2 startup program. Then the program which is most recent is the Startup Development Officers Program, and we'll talk more about that in the subsequent slides. So Rhea, if you can go to the next one. So here's the model that emerged from our discussions across the network, and this was reviewed on the East and West Coast of the United States, several locations. And what you can see is a progression from research activities in the top left, which are federally funded or private, moving across towards startups that are often housed in universities. At the bottom right, you have the corporates and the investors, and there was a lot of fragmentation in the system. So we envisioned the idea of a corporate commercialization council as a way to bring the partners together and integrate and align the resources and interests of each of the partners to accelerate development and make it more efficient. And I think that we've achieved that in some measure and are continuing to work towards that goal. So the next slide, please. So the Startup Development Program takes advantage of the $137 billion in federally funded research at university and federal laboratories. This is a pool of intellectual knowledge and resource that provides an excellent opportunity for researchers and entrepreneurs to build university startups around the intellectual property generated by that investment. NSET 2, Fortune 500 members and SDOs will partner with startups that come as out of university research and housed within universities to develop them and accelerate their progress. Next slide. We do that in part through startup development officers, and that's with an understanding that often what is a barrier to startups progressing rapidly in their development is lack of experienced talent to guide them through the many hurdles that they have, especially in the gap in the early stages of their development. So the Startup Development Officers and the Startup Development Program at NSET 2 provides experienced individuals to participate and work with faculty, researchers, and students. Next one. Some of the services they provide are especially targeting the management teams of university entrepreneurs, students, and faculty. They can include business plans, proof of concepts, prototyping, early product development, government funding in the SBIR, other venues, angel and venture funding, and building teams, which will be the subject of the webinar today. We often talk about commercialization experiments in NSET 2, and this is a way to rapidly test concepts with our network of companies, angels, and investors, VC investors, and serial entrepreneurs. It's an early read on the commercialization potential for that particular startup and what it might take to get it to market. Next slide, please. So the benefits to the startups and entrepreneurs, faculty, researchers, and students are access to the Startup Development Officers to help them create development fund. For the universities, it's moving intellectual property to market for significant impact, and also to accelerate the training of the students who work in those startups alongside of the Startup Development Officers and the other individuals on the management team. Next slide, please. So to engage, as Rhea mentioned, if you're a university, you can submit your intellectual property to NSET 2, and it will be reviewed by Startup Development Officers and our corporate partners, and you can receive some feedback from that intellectual property, and that can be the beginning of creating the relationships to either create those startups or move them along with the input from those individuals. If you are an individual who would like to be a Startup Development Officer, then you can explore that with us at the email address shown under 2, startupdevelopment@nset2.org. Next slide, please. Chris brings over 3 decades of experience as a corporate officer and board member in multiple biotech enterprises, ranging from oncology to neurostem cells to pharmaceutical manufacturing equipment and biomedical information technology. As a technology company founder and executive, her responsibilities have included fundraising, business development, operations, build out, CGMP manufacturing, regulatory affairs, HR, international marketing, sales, corporate communication, PR, investor relations, legislative liaison, and R&D. She served as CEO of ASM Resources Incorporated, a seed venture fund of the American Society of Microbiology. She has 10 years of laboratory research experience, and she has authored peer-reviewed scientific articles, book chapters, and patent applications. Chris received her PhD in molecular biology from the University of Birmingham Department of Cancer Studies in the UK, and joined Cold Spring Harbor Labs Cell Laboratory under the direction of Dr. James D. Watson. She's the founder of 2 publicly traded companies, Microfluidics and Neurostem. She serves on the board of the Washington, D.C. Archangels and chairs their BioLife Science Caucus. She's currently a board member and advisory board member of several private BioLife Science companies and set to start development officer. So Chris has quite a wide background covering all the way from generation of the intellectual property content and research all the way through the commercialization and operational side of things.
Today we're going to talk about building your management leadership team, which includes your board of directors and a couple of advisory boards. Next slide. What you need these people to do for you is to help you turn your ideas into something that ultimately delivers a product to the end user that you envisioned when you invented it. And that's a long pathway, particularly for biological companies, but for almost any company, it's a major undertaking. And it's essential that you have that goal in your sights from the very beginning. Otherwise, you will spend time and effort and resources not wisely. And so it's very important to get a grip of this. And you can't expect, as an inventor, to have all this at your fingertips. So next slide, please. Nevertheless, you're going to have to develop some kind of credible action plan of your own, and you need to identify the underlying assumptions in that plan and create a detailed an operational plan, actual stepwise operational plan on a Gantt chart, preferably, to explain to the people you're going to recruit what it is you're planning to do. And there's no doubt whatever that what you put together with this plan to begin with will bear no resemblance to what you ultimately do, or very little resemblance to what you ultimately do. But it's a tool to use during the process of recruiting your teams that will help you build a more robust plan, moment by moment, with the input of people, not only the people who join, but some of the people who end up not joining will have contributed to your planning process. And it helps you to defend your capital requirements, even if it's merely to family and friends and fools who are raising money. You still have to tell them why you need the money and what you're going to do with it, and why it will get you where you need to go. And it's never too soon to know your competition, because you may have a grand idea and you may be able to get it realized, but if you can't get it realized in a value proposition as well as a technical proposition, then you'll be beaten by the competition. And you also need to know how you're going to provide your investors with exits, because they're not there just for the joy of the ride, they're there to make a return on their investment. So the next slide. Next slide. Shoot. All right, so as I'm saying, it's not a good idea to try and go it alone, and it's never too soon to start. I mean, you probably at this point have made your aha moment, filed your intellectual property with your tech transfer office, and be looking at what it will take to get the first grants into your company. Now is the time to start building your teams. It may seem like ridiculously early stage in the game, but it isn't really. You really do need to start to get as much help as you possibly can for as little money as you can possibly get it for. And the variety of teams that you will be building are the key ones. Board of directors. If you're going to do this, you should start an actual company, preferably a C corporation. And for that, you'll need a board of directors. And then clearly you'll need management to do the actual daily work. And advisory boards are key for several reasons that we'll go into downstream. But it's best to have separate ones for scientific and business because the generation of the ideas on those two boards is slightly different and is much easier to manage if you have them separated. Next slide. Now, the board of directors should include the founders, at least to begin with, at least for the first few years. And it should always include at least one external member. And I know it's probably very obvious, but besides keeping it small, you should also keep it with an uneven number of participants because you do not want to have locked decisions. You want to have uneven voting, which should lead to a decision. The board of directors has a very key responsibility. It has the fiduciary responsibility for the oversight of the operations and the management of any monies that become invested in the company, the management of the intellectual property and of partnerships and so forth. So they don't do the day-to-day operations, but they have not only very important jobs, but they have very important exposures with those jobs. Downstream, investors will want to have board seats representing their very significant interest in your company. So at that point, you may expand your board beyond just the addition of the investor. You may add another external member, or you may add a member to keep the number of people uneven, and so on and so forth. Some investors will only seek visitation rights. And in that situation, they're not a voting member, but they're not totally invisible. They're there to listen, but they also voice their opinions usually, and they can sway votes amongst the people who have votes. So that's something to consider as well when you're taking investors, and you might say, well, it doesn't really matter that our chemistry with this group isn't that good because they only want visitation rights. Well, don't take money from people you don't have good chemistry with, even if all they want is visitation rights. Next slide. Management. So founders and inventors are the people who first start driving this process, but they may not wish to leave their tenured position at the university or the hospital and may not want to have a life as an entrepreneur in a startup. And so they won't join as the CEO or even as the chief scientific officer. However, they can contribute quite a lot to this process early on by bringing in other skilled professionals who might be engaged in guiding the company, so convincing people like that to join one or other of these boards, or in participating in grant applications where the validation of the technology is advanced through the execution of the grant. Similarly, the founders or inventors, students, and postdocs can contribute to the reduction of risk in the company by doing creator research, and can be supported by grants from government as well as monies from the company in order to do those critical experiments that may be needed to validate or to create interest by a particular party or whatever. Fractional executives are the other people that you need to, whether you have a founder or an inventor as a CEO and or CSO, you're going to need other executives in addition. If you don't have a CEO from the founders, then you're going to try and find someone who is willing to give at least a 50% effort to becoming the CEO or president of the company in order to drive the process, because it is very time consuming. You'll also need legal, operational, and if you don't have the CFO, you're going to need one, and you're going to need financial CFO. The legal part can be handled by legal firms as opposed to a VP of legal. The There are many legal firms around the country who offer programs for startups where they have reduced fees and or equity arrangements to allow the company to engage with serious legal advice right from day one and do things correctly. And it's well worth exploring what programs of that nature are available from the legal firms in your region. You also need downstream a vice president of business development and vice president of regulatory affairs. And it's not as downstream as you'd think. It's not at the point when you would be necessarily going out doing business development or necessarily talking to the FDA or other regulatory agencies that are important for your startup. It's at the point when you're actually framing your 5-year plan and what it's going to cost and how it's going to be executed. You need input from these people in order to make a Gantt chart that works and a financial projection and budget that goes along with it and makes it real. So you're going to have to somehow recruit these people on a fractional basis. Next slide. So a scientific advisory board is a good idea too. The people who start the company should know who the people are in their field that are going to find what they're doing compelling and would want to be part of the story and to recruit them. And with them come the connections that they have to other academics potentially and to institutions. And sometimes, if they've done this multiple times, they'll have connections to sources of capital or state programs and stuff like that. Having academic leaders amongst the members of the scientific advisory board can be very validating to outsiders in the process of doing due diligence on the company. It looks good. It's not just window dressing though. They're not just window dressing. They can be contributory, even to the point of actually contributing intellectual property. And clinical leaders, similarly, are going to be important for validating the concept of the company and the products. But they can also be accesses to clinical sites that can be used downstream, and certainly can be access to clinical sites who can validate the clinical program. I prefer to see at least a proportion of the members of the scientific advisory board have some prior board experience, so that it's not too much of a management headache to get from questions to answers during the course of the regular board meeting. So that next slide, please. The business advisory board. Many companies think of putting this off till later in the game, but again, I believe it should be something you should do early on, primarily because it can impact in many ways the timing and the cost of your development plan for your company. These people should have varied expertise. Some of them should be very competent in doing startups from day one, because it's not quite the same as running an operational company. Capital access routes are going to be important, and your business advisory board should be a major source of access to, well, not necessarily individual investors, but to programs that will lead to investors, to getting those right kinds of invitations, to getting heard at the right meetings and stuff like that. And they should have, you should have at least one expansion stage person on the advisory board, someone who's familiar with getting into professional grade investment and corporate collaborations. Those are the kind of things that are very validating downstream. They don't happen immediately, but you can be grooming yourselves as a company for those activities. And it's easy to do if you have somebody on your business advisory board who knows what a good prospect looks like, as opposed to one that's a ho-hum prospect. It's much better to have that advice to begin with and to be positioning yourself appropriately. Next slide. All right, so how do you recruit all these people when you haven't raised any cash, any money to speak of? The core management gets founder shares, which are at the very start of the company are basically worth de minimis amounts and don't represent a tax liability. Nevertheless, they should be getting stock options that vest over a period, say 3 to 5 years, to protect them against the dilution they'll inevitably face as you do actually get investment into the company. And once there's cash in the company, core management ought to be paid, even if they're paid fractionally, they ought to be paid something. And I didn't fit it on here, but they should also get their expenses as well. Fractional management, on the other hand, people who are putting in 10 or less than 20% of their time often can do that just for expenses and stock options. Some may request warrants. The difference between the stock options and warrants is stock options vest. And some people might want to have warrants up front, something they can exercise whenever, just to gain their attention, and then stock options going forward to keep their attention. The board of directors, scientific advisory board, and business advisory board members, you need to be able to cover their expenses. And again, there's the stock option warrant balancing act, and it should try to keep it as even-handed as you possibly can. If some board members got warrants to join, then it's not irrational that other members might expect to get warrants to join as well. And that should affect the stock option program that they subsequently participate in. The other thing that the scientific advisory board members might participate in is some of the grants that the company raises, where you do, say, an SBIR or an FTTR, and they are the recipients of some of that grant money. So they can also benefit from that, and that's part of the recruitment incentive for them to participate. The next slide. The next slide. Thank you. Okay, so just to sort of revisit what the non-cash compensation consists of. Equity is membership, or sorry, ownership of your company, unlike an LLC or an LLP where it's a membership share. So equity comes in different flavors. Common shares are what's initially authorized by the company. Preferred shares are shares that are negotiated with investors. So they have preferences over holders of common shares, particularly in the case of things like a wind-up. Preferred shareholders have a preference over common shareholders for retrieving their investment and the liquidation of the company. And it may be a 1x, a 2x, or even a 3x preference over common shareholders. So those shares can be much more robust than the common shares originally existing. And then options and warrants talk about shares that are not issued but can be issued in the future. Similarly, the employee stock option plan and the non-qual plan used for board members and consultants also deal with shares that are being vested over time. And what the company has to do is you always have to have authorized enough shares to pay out 100% of all of these awards of warrants, vesting options, and the ESOP, should everybody in a moment of enthusiasm exercise all of those things. So you have to have enough shares authorized in the kitty for the company to cover all of that. And that sort of modulates how much you're spending on the maintenance of your C Corp, but it's not an enormous amount of money, and it's much better than having to pay everybody in cash. So it's good to become familiar with the structure of the C Corporation and the incentive non-cash compensation tools that are available to attract and retain these kinds of people. Next slide. And not to forget that these people are people who are giving you serious advice and for which you're giving them serious compensation in the form of equity, which could be worth a whole lot more than if they'd been paid in cash at the time that it was contracted. So you need to be contracted with them. It may be, in the case of your fractional management team, it may be an employment contract. In the case of others, it will probably be a consulting contract or a board contract. One of the things you need to have in those contracts is to allow for mutual termination at will as things change, chemistries change, or people's occupations change and they can no longer make the commitment. So people need to be able to get out of it. You need to be able to get out of it. So 15, 30, or 60-day at will termination is a reasonable thing to have in there. And also you should try and get IP assignments. Not everyone will sign these, but you should try to get them. And non-compete agreements are even more important to have. But in the face of those two things, you have to recognize that the field of reference they will be willing to sign for could be quite tight. It's not going to be, for example, all of oncology. It might be some specific segment. It probably wouldn't even be all of monoclonals in oncology. That would be a very big umbrella. You would need something tighter than that. You don't want it to be too tight, but you want to be tight enough that it makes sense for the business purposes of your company. And another thing to think of is incorporating the RCDA into those contracts in order to keep it up to date instead of chasing those expiration dates all the time. You want to have a permanent RCDA with your advisory boards. And as I keep saying, start out with an option plan so that you have a much less complicated cap table when it comes to doing a nice financing deal. Next slide. Whoa. Okay, thank you. So the other thing you have to do once you've recruited your teams is once you have them, you have to make them work. They have to do something. They have to create value. And that requires you to manage them. And your internal management group should meet weekly, even if it's just a phone call, just to make sure everyone knows what's going on and what's required of them in the coming week. Board meetings can be monthly to start with and gradually can become quarterly. Advisory board meetings, it's quarterly is easily enough, I would say. And once a year, you probably should try to have everybody present physically or virtually to a meeting that lasts at least one day, possibly two. Downstream, you may have strategic retreats around a specific initiative. And those definitely would be as many people as possible in person. And all through these various meeting schedules, you need to keep up individual communication with people so that the tasks you assigned get paid attention to and the deliverables you're expecting come back to you in the form which you were hoping for. So staying on top of all of this is absolutely key. Otherwise, you'll have a very nice website and not much performance. So next slide. Okay, so I'll just quickly go over this slide. The team members are going to be looking for the same thing in your company before they join as an investor does. They're going to look at the rest of the management. What group are they joining? What is the market opportunity you're trying to address? And do you have a competitive advantage to do so? What does your IP coverage look like? And will you have the freedom to operate to actually turn it into a business? What are your financials like and whether it will get you to an inflection point? Do you know how you're going to use those funds and how are you going to get to your exit? They're going to look at those things just as much as an investor would, because in truth, they're investing themselves, their sweat equity into your company. Next slide. And these people are, well, serial entrepreneurs, obviously, industry veterans with non-conflicting day jobs, but surprisingly nice to have. And retired corporate executives are also a good source. Obviously, academic and clinical faculty are those are the people you turn to for your advisory boards in those areas. But you can also get help from angels and investing VCs, and even corporate venture funds will have membership that helps to provide guidance. And strategic corporate partners will definitely be giving you guidance, whether you want it or not. And then you will have, if you have foreign investors, they will probably have an opinion about what's going on domestically as well as what's going on in their foreign markets. Next slide. So then the question is, how do you find these people? And quite frankly, it's not that straightforward to do it. It requires quite a bit of work. And you have to get out and about. You have to join various angel groups, maybe go and present, and you may find people who are interested in what you're doing amongst the audience. Your local incubator could be a good source. They often have a cadre of people who are looking for opportunities just like yours, and they go to incubators to go look for them. So it's a good place to go and mix and mingle at those events, whatever they might be, in order to hook up, or even talk to incubator managers who may actually know people who would fit your shopping list. And then various equity forums around the country that have people who are not just investors, but are looking for their next management opportunity. National and international meetings, all of these meetings are good to go to for looking for cash, obviously, but they're also good to go to for looking for personnel and people to help you. And of course, NSET 2 has a whole program in startup development, which is manned by startup development officers, where they can assist, they can be part of your board, they can interact with key corporates and various angels and so forth. So they can be very useful, and I'm sure that the team at NSET can tell you more about how that works. But it's definitely work to go about finding these people. It's definitely worthwhile to put a lot of energy into it, even though it's early days, because you're going to be living with it for a substantial amount of time. And the best way to have a good result is to have a good team. And a good team requires you to look at their credentials, their past experiences, their past successes, and also to consider their chemistry with each other and with your management team directly. So those are all things to consider in picking people. Finding the people to start with is the first step, and NSET 2 can help you with doing just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Ria.
Yeah, so I have the first question on the screen now.
Okay, thank you. So our first question is, do board members and advisors have to be paid or given equity into the company? Chris?
Well, I think you're not going to get people to take on the exposure of being on a board of directors without being paid in any shape or form. And the very least, what board of directors expect are that their basic expenses of attending board meetings and other events required by the company be paid for, and that they have a reasonable equity package in the form of options. You don't want to be giving them outright stock grants because they may not stick around very long, in which case that was a waste. Plus, it gives them an unfunded tax liability, so they probably wouldn't want it anyway. And if you give them options, you're only parting with equity as it vests and as they deliver service. So if you terminate service on the at-will clause, the option has to be exercised usually within about 3 months, the vested part of the option, and the rest of the option disappears. So people don't get paid for time they don't put in. They only get paid even in equity for time they do put in.
Thank you. Next question. What do startup companies pay to their board members? Chris?
Usually it's not cash. Like we were just talking about it. They pay in options, which vest over time, usually over 3 years. So typically an option plan will not vest for 12 months. So unless you stick around for 12 months, you don't actually get any options that are real. Then they tend to vest either every month or every quarter, so that, you know, if you work for a board for a year and 4 months, then that's what you get compensated for in terms of options. Whereas if you work there for 3 years, you will have vested enough options to have 3 years worth of options. The other thing about options is that more options can be issued during the life of sitting on a board for 3 years. So you have an existing stock option that recruited you. Other stock options can be awarded as the company perhaps hits important milestones in which capital is invested into the company. And the reason for issuing more options to board members is that they probably contributed to that process of getting that deal closed. And the deal probably generated money that bought shares in the company, and that will have diluted everyone with existing shares. So it's a way to re-up their position in the company by earning more options over time. And that's another reason why you might pay board members more than once in stock options.
Do you, Chris, do you have an idea of what the cap table might look like, just representatively, how much goes to the board members versus other investors?
Well, usually you put a reserve on the number of common shares that are authorized for the company of around 20% for the funding of the stock option plan, out of which everybody who gets stock options is going to be compensated. And so the remainder of the equity is in founder shares and shares that may be kept in reserve by the company. Mm-hmm. And those shares are used to do deals, where if you did a venture capital investment and you took in $3 or $5 million, they would get shares. They would get preferred shares. They'd have a different class of shares, but you have to have common shares authorized to cover the issuance of those shares. So it erodes that quantity of common shares that's in reserve. And they also probably will get warrants to invest again downstream when the company gets more successful. So that will be an additional dilution. And those warrants have to be covered by common shares that are reserved in the company. But those don't bite, that doesn't bite into, none of those, the preferred shares and the warrants do not bite into the 20% that you can allocate to members of your boards and to employees. And downstream, when there's been a number of investments and a lot of commitment made, then the stock option plan will ask to have more shares authorized into the plan to true up the percentage of shares encumbered by the stock option plan in order to keep reinforcing the need for people to participate. Even when you've gotten funding into the company, you don't start paying people in cash until you actually have a major exit, or you go on the market and you start making massive amounts of money, for example, then that might be a reason to start paying people in cash, at which point they won't want cash, they'll want shares. So anyway.
Thank you much. What's the next question? How can NSET2 help out together our startup and team? What's the startup development program and how can we participate? So NSET2 in the startup development program, what we are doing is we are receiving intellectual property options, basically, not options, but we're asking universities to tell us about intellectual property in their portfolios. And we do that in a defined way. So universities can fill out a form online describing that intellectual property to us in a non-confidential way. We take that intellectual property and have it evaluated by our corporate network and by our startup development officers. And for the things where there's significant interest on both sides, we can come back to the university and we can start to investigate creating a startup from that intellectual property. Along with that, typically will come a couple of startup development officers to assist and accelerate the development of that startup. What we saw when we were talking to different members of the ecosystem for commercializing university research is that oftentimes management talent is in lack, and startups can be created, but they don't progress that fast towards commercialization, either because of lack of funding or because they lack a certain expertise in an area. So the startup development officers bring that expertise online for them, and through their networks can also help identify people to move it along. So I think it's a real leg up in that way. In return, the startup development officers become part of the management team, and they receive the compensation that Chris has been describing earlier on. We also can work with existing startups through the demo day and that activity to link them to corporates once they have something that starts to look commercializable, and start to work with the corporates to have them engage in the later stage development, number one. Number two, there can be various kinds of relationships from supply agreements, partnerships, and even acquisition. So we can, I think, have a role all the way across the time continuum of development for startups. Next question. If you compensate the board of directors with stock, how much do you vest? Chris, do you want to take a crack at this one?
Sure. So this is going to be, the vesting cycle is usually 3 to 5 years. It depends on, to some degree, how long it's going to take the company to get to an inflection point of valuation. So if it's a device or a diagnostic, you might be vesting over 3 years. If it's a stem cell company or something like that that has a longer runway, you might vest over 5 years. And it's not so much the vesting that's important, it's whether or not you get enough shares in any award, the initial award and then any subsequent awards that are made around inflection point realizations. So you could be looking at something like 0.5% of the initial corporation, maybe to as high as 1.5% of the initial corporation. And that board of director members would not be expecting, it may be on a 3-year vesting cycle, would not necessarily be expecting other awards for, several years. But then they would be expecting in a 3 to 5 year range getting additional awards once they have vested their first award, because you should be taking in investments from third parties in the form of cash, and that will be shared out the door, which will be diluting the position of the board of directors members. So if they come in at 1% at the beginning, once you start to get investment in, they will be, they may at the end of that 3-year period only have a 0.5% option, and so they'd be looking for more to build that out. They'll never get back to the position they were in at the beginning, though, in all likelihood. Because hopefully you're raising a lot of money.
Thank you. Next question. Do members of the original management team, especially if they are co-founders, get equal equity, or is it common that the CEO gets more? Chris?
Yeah, the CEO usually gets more. Sometimes the CEO and the CSO get equivalent amounts. It's very much about a contribution. It's very personalized from one company to another. But a CEO, at the very start of the operation, a CEO might have as little as, say, 20% of the operation and still go ahead with it. But I think that you've got to have a clever balance between getting the interest and retaining the interest of that person through the key first few years, even if later on someone else takes that role. It's very important to keep the person motivated. And the CSO should not be sidelined either, because after all, if it were not for those inventions, there wouldn't be anything to commercialize. So It's a balancing act.
Hmm. Okay, thank you. Next question. If legal firm takes equity in the company, does it create a conflict of interest? Chris, I'll let you answer that one.
Well, I'm sure that they have ways of managing that, because I'm familiar with several firms who do this exercise, but I have not actually participated in one of the exercises, so I don't quite know how they put up a Chinese wall. But I presume there's a Chinese wall between the equity and that's going into the compensation of the firm and the lawyers who are actually conducting the work for the company. So, I mean, that's a common exercise that law firms do, so I just assume that's how they're doing it.
Okay, next question. We use betting by performance. Option matches accomplishment, not based on time, but on performance. Is that consistent with your presentation, Chris?
Yes, it is. If you've made an award of an option plan at the very beginning and you are less than thrilled with how things have gone subsequently, you can always award fewer options downstream to balance it out. And if you undercompensated somebody and they've done something wonderful, you can always increase their option package. You can even accelerate parts of that option package if you think it's desirable. So you have flexibility, and it's very important to do performance evaluations and match the compensation that's non-cash with the actual deliverables that are coming in.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Does the startup development program only accept startups? I have IP and would like to see if I can be a startup. Can I get feedback from corporates you work with? Yes, absolutely. That's our IP to Startup program. And if you go to the website nset2.org, you can find where to submit that intellectual property. So next question.
Okay, Glenn, I think we only have time for one more question, so here it is.
Okay, if major intellectual properties are to be developed during early phase of the company, how do you get funding to execute the development plan to get to intellectual property? I'll take a little bit of a crack at that. There are several different sources of money. Sometimes there's state and local grants. There's government money available either in the form of research grants or the Small Business Innovation Research, or STTR, grants as well, and that can cover early stage development. And for some of the larger SBIR grants, you will need to have a management team, and it does need to be to a startup. So those are requirements for those. Beyond that, then you start to look to private investors, such as angels and VCs. So I'll let Chris comment here a little bit too, having been a private investor.
Well, the challenge with early stage is that, for example, SBIR grants don't really have a line item for paying for intellectual property protection. So they will help you though with validating the concepts behind the filings you might make. So you can get those kinds of grants. You can also get development grants from local and state agencies that can help you with that. Finding money to do the actual patent filings usually is something where you need family, friends, and souls to contribute. And the important thing about taking money from family, friends, and souls is that you do want to be able to go to Thanksgiving dinner every year thereafter. And so you have to be very straightforward with how their investment is going to be used. But that's one way people pay for the actual IP filing after having done the development work. But realize you have 12 months after the filing to do more work to supplement your filing before the end of the 12-month period.
Sometimes I'll just chime in here too a little bit. Sometimes an interested corporate will work with you on intellectual property, and that can help as well. Okay, so Ria, I'll turn over to you. action here. If you want to submit your IP to NCET2 and have it vetted by our corporate network and our startup development officers, you can do that at the website on ncet2.org, and it's a fairly simple format, easy to fill out, and we'd be excited to receive those. If you want to be a startup development officer and come from one of the categories there or similar, then send your CV in a short note to the email address shown there, startupdevelopment@ncet2.org. And with that, I will turn it over to Ria with my thanks for all of you attending, and to Chris for presenting.
Okay, thank you, Glenn, and thank you, Christine. So good afternoon, everyone, again, and thank you for joining us. So if you have questions, just email us at support@ncet2.org, and we're looking forward to seeing you in next week's webinar. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Rhea.